before cities, before nations, before even memory had a name. There was the cold. It didn't ask for permission. It didn't offer mercy. It swept in with claws, silent, ruthless, absolute. And standing against that cold was us, not as conquerors, not as kings, but as menders, as stitchers, as those who refuse to vanish. This is not a story of conquest. It's a story of blankets, of cradles, of calloused hands working in the dark, doing what had to be done. And it didn't begin with thunder. It began with a whisper that still echoes, if we're quiet enough to hear it. If stories like this awaken something in you, leave a comment, hit like, or subscribe to Prehistoric Shadows. Before we begin our 12 chapters, to remember the forgotten ones who kept the fire alive for all of humanity. They never held spears. They didn't carve mammoth bones into monuments or paint hunting scenes onto cave walls. They weren't warriors or chieftains or the ones who decided where to move next. But they mattered. These were the hands that cooked the marrow, wove the fibers, mended the hides, and wrapped the sick in furs. They soothed children through night terrors and kept the fire burning when the winds screamed like wolves. These hands, wrinkled, calloused, gentle, were the ones that turned survival into something more than just a battle. In the stories of Ice Age endurance, it's easy to glorify the hunters, the explorers, the fire makers. But in truth, the world was kept warm not by conquest, but by care. The unsung ones stitched the coats, dried the meat, healed the wounds, and passed down memory not through words, but through hands-on lessons repeated day after day. They worked in silence, often in shadow. And yet, without them, the strong would have perished. They didn't lead the tribe, but they held it together. History tends to remember the loudest voices, the boldest acts. But the truth, it was the quiet labor, the hidden work, the forgotten hands that saved us from extinction, and maybe still do. They were small, fragile, often overlooked. But in the darkest winters of the Ice Age, it was the children who carried more than just their own future. They were memory in motion. In games, they mimicked the adults, pretending to hunt, to cook, to care. But behind their laughter was something more. Rehearsal, training. The passing of knowledge not through lectures, but through play. They listened when no one thought they were. They watched how to tie sinew, how to start a fire with flint and breath, how to hear the warning crack of thin ice before it gave way. And when elders grew quiet, when warriors didn't return, children became the keepers of what remained. It wasn't just survival they inherited. It was the culture, the stories, the rituals. Even in frost-bitten caves, you'd find small carvings etched by tiny fingers. Symbols, lines, songs without sound. They weren't decoration, they were practice, legacy in its earliest form. Some of them didn't live long, but those who did became bridges between the old world and the next. We think of children as needing protection, and they do. But back then, they also protected us from forgetting. They carried what couldn't be written, and in doing so, they made sure we didn't disappear with the cold. They walked slower. Their backs were bent, their breath short. To the eye, they looked like those clinging to life. But in truth, they were the ones holding the tribe together. In the Ice Age, survival wasn't just a matter of strength. It was a matter of memory. And the elders, the ones with creased faces and stories behind their eyes, were the living archives of a world without writing. They knew where the herds migrated when the moon tilted just so. They remembered the taste of poison berries misjudged in a bad season. They could feel a storm coming by the ache in their bones. Their value wasn't in what they could lift, but in what they could recall. Young hunters might chase the mammoth, but only the old knew where the ice cracks lay hidden, or when the wind would shift to bring the scent of wolves. A single mistake out there meant death. Knowledge wasn't a luxury. It was currency. And the elders traded it freely. Not with pride, but with purpose. They taught not in lectures, but in pauses, in warnings muttered near the fire, in stories told with one eye half closed, not just for entertainment, but to encode lessons in memory. They weren't burdens. They were guides, compasses carved by time. And when they finally lay down to rest, bones cold, eyes closed, it wasn't the end of a life. It was the closing of a book, one that, if not carefully passed down, would be lost in the snow forever. To us, fire is simple. A flick of a lighter, a push of a button. But to them, it was a living thing. A spirit to be coaxed, not commanded. In the frozen nights of the Ice Age, fire wasn't just warmth. It was survival. Light. Protection. A heartbeat for the cold-buried world. And not everyone could call it to life. There were those, quiet, patient, who understood fire like a language. They read the grain of bark, the mood of wind, the silence before a spark caught. They didn't just make fire, they crafted it, controlled its shape, softened its smoke, hid its glow when danger crept nearby. These were not brutes. They were technicians of heat, engineers of flame. They layered wood like recipes, dry moss beneath shaved birch, pine resin to catch, split twigs angled like prayer hands. A single ember, breathed into being, became warmth for a dozen lives. But their genius didn't stop at survival. They used fire to bend bone, to harden tools, to melt animal fat into lamp oil. They experimented, adapted, innovated. They whispered to fire, and fire whispered back. When the cave walls pulsed orange and shadows danced like ghosts, the fire whisperers sat closest, feeding it just enough. Never too much. Always listening. They weren't priests. They weren't kings. But without them, the cold would have taken us all. And even now, beneath stoves, wires, furnaces, we owe them something. Because fire didn't just cook our food. It forged our path through the dark. When we picture Ice Age homes, we imagine caves, dark, damp, unchanging. But the truth is, far more inventive. Some did take refuge in caves, yes. But caves weren't always where the people were. Shelter had to move with the herd, rise on frozen ground, and stand against winds that could flay flesh from bone. And so, humans built, designed, engineered. These weren't huts thrown together in panic. They were shelters of strategy. Walls made from mammoth bones, arched, interlocked, braced against collapse. Roofs layered with hides, weighted with stones, sloped to drain meltwater. Entrances angled away from prevailing winds. Hearths sunk into the floor to trap heat. Some even had suspended floors, raised above the icy ground to keep moisture and frost from creeping in. Inside, space wasn't random. There were zones, for sleep, for tool-making, for cooking, for care. Every inch mattered when life depended on it. And this wasn't just instinct. It was applied knowledge, passed on, improved, refined over generations. The first blueprints weren't drawn in ink. They were remembered in muscle, repetition, and need. These ancient architects didn't wear titles. They wore furs stiff with smoke. They built not for fame, but for survival. And in doing so, they laid the groundwork for every house, every city, every home we know today. Because even in the coldest time in human history, someone still looked at the ice and imagined walls strong enough to keep it out. There were no treaties, no flags, no written laws. But make no mistake, diplomacy existed. Not shouted across marble halls, but spoken in silence, through gifts, through risk, through trust. Across the frozen continent, people moved, carried flint, obsidian, seashells, ochre. Items that didn't just feed or clothe, they connected, and someone had to carry them. Across rivers, through hostile lands, past strangers with spears drawn and eyes wary. These were the silent diplomats. They had no armies behind them, just memory, instinct, and the courage to walk into the unknown with something to offer. To trade meant more than giving and getting. It meant being understood. It meant knowing when to bow, when to speak, when not to. It meant recognizing a glance as a threat, or an outstretched hand as a welcome. One mistake, and the journey ended in blood. But when it worked, a tool forged in the Caucasus ended up in northern Europe. A Baltic amber bead made its way to the Black Sea. A spondylus shell crossed mountains, passed hand to hand, worn like a passport by those who'd earned the right to wear it. These weren't merchants as we know them. They were bridges, walk-in packs, human agreements moving through ice and fear. Every step they took helped stitch together a continent, not with words, but with will. In a world before borders, they proved that survival didn't require conquest. Sometimes, it simply required the courage to reach out and not pull back. They didn't carry spears or lead the hunts, but every life that made it through the Ice Age began with them, and often was saved by them. They were mothers, but not just of children, of ideas, of breakthroughs, of quiet revolutions that no one carved onto cave walls. In the depths of winter, while the world cracked under cold, they layered fur not just for warmth, but for movement, for breathing, for skin too tender to touch ice. They mixed herbs into broth to soothe fevered brows, chewed roots to soften them for the toothless, stored milk in dried bladders, wrapped infants to skin for shared warmth. They didn't just survive. They studied, tested, tried. Not with theory, but with instinct honed by risk. A sick child didn't give them weeks to ponder. A mistake meant death. And so, they became early scientists, measuring without numbers, calculating without charts. They knew which plants calmed pain, which mosses absorbed blood, how to swaddle a newborn to mimic the womb, how to bury a stillborn without breaking. They healed with hands that had no gloves, birthed with no midwives, fed tribes with no certainty of tomorrow. And they passed it all on, mother to daughter, grandmother to niece, not in lectures, but in daily acts, repeated, remembered, respected. When we think of innovation, we picture tools, weapons, great leaps. But in truth, it was often a whisper, a cradle, a cup, a remedy, a woman in the shadows, keeping humanity alive one heartbeat at a time. They didn't leave behind tools, no weapons, no grand bones stacked in the snow. What they left behind was harder to see, but far more lasting. They were the ones who remembered the songs, the rhythms, the stories whispered by firelight when the hunt had failed and the wind howled outside like a god in mourning. We call them storytellers, artists, but they were more than that. They were architects of identity, because without story, there is no us. They painted hands on cave walls, not to decorate, but to say, I was here. We were here. They carved symbols into bone, scratched meaning into stone. They passed wisdom in patterns, braids, tattoos, beaded lines across fur. These were not adornments. They were memory made visible. In a world without writing, every mark mattered. Every tale carried more than entertainment. It held maps, warnings, triumphs, grief. A lullaby could be a survival guide, a dance, a coded history. When elders died, it was these people who kept their voices alive. When children were born, it was these people who showed them what it meant to belong. Not just to a family, but to something larger. A people, a memory, a direction. The culture keepers didn't fight the cold with fire or bone. They fought it with meaning, with connection, with the reminder that life wasn't just about surviving the storm. It was about remembering why we endure it. They didn't just hunt animals, they hunted patterns. They tracked the invisible, the turning of stars, the shifting of wind, the rhythm of ice and thaw. These were not men with brute strength or sharper spears. They were observers, students of time itself. They knew that mammoths moved not by whim, but by season. That caribou crossed rivers when the moon swelled just right. That birds disappeared days before a blizzard hit. They read the land like scripture, each crack in the mud, each broken twig, a passage in a larger book. They moved not fastest, but smartest. Because in the Ice Age, guessing meant starvation. They didn't have calendars, but they had memory, measured in footprints and smoke trails, in the feel of cold that came too soon. They taught their children not just where to look, but when. Not just what to kill, but how long to wait. These were the hunters who knew patience, who sat for hours in stillness, listening for the silence that comes just before a herd arrives. They were not trackers of beasts, they were trackers of time itself. And what they gave us was more than food. They gave us foresight, the beginning of planning, the first steps toward agriculture, astronomy, civilization. Because before we ever built cities, we had to learn when to stay and when to move. And that lesson didn't come from muscle. It came from watching the shadows and learning how they fall. In the modern world, we divide roles by gender. But in the Ice Age, survival didn't care what you were called. When the men didn't come back from the hunt, someone had to trap, to skin, to feed. When a mother fell ill, someone else, father, sister, elder, took the infant to their chest and kept it warm with borrowed body heat. Out there, under the weight of snow and silence, roles didn't break. They bent, and in that bending, humanity adapted. What mattered wasn't who should do the work. What mattered was who could. And so, boundaries blurred. There is evidence of women buried with spears, tools worn, not ceremonial. Men found alongside children's toys, caregivers, not just hunters. Communities that worked because everyone did what was needed, not what was expected. This wasn't equality as an ideal. It was equality as a necessity. Fluidity not born of theory, but of firewood needing to be gathered before nightfall. In that world, strength wasn't masculine. Nurture wasn't feminine. Both were human, and both were required. The cold didn't ask what you believed. It only asked, can you help us live through this? And if you could, you mattered. Maybe we think we've come far, but in many ways, the Ice Age was ahead of us. Because when everything is on the line, it's not your role that defines you. It's your response. History remembers the sharp things: blades, spears, traps. But what truly kept us alive in the Ice Age was softness. A strip of fur, stitched just right, became a glove that saved fingers. Grass woven into sandals kept frostbite from crawling up bare feet. A pouch made from bladder carried water across frozen valleys where rivers had turned to stone. These weren't weapons. They were tools of care. And they were everywhere. Tailored layers wrapped tight to trap heat, with gaps small enough to stop the wind but wide enough to breathe. Lichen packed into wounds, milk stored in hollowed bone, fire carried in slow-burning embers wrapped in moss, so the next camp didn't start from nothing. These were the soft technologies, invisible to time, lost in soil and decay, but essential. They didn't win battles, but they won mornings. They let a tribe wake up still alive, and the minds behind them weren't always warriors. They were mothers, tanners, tinkerers, children who noticed which moss stayed dry, people who thought not in domination, but in design. Softness is often mistaken for weakness, but in the Ice Age, it was the opposite. Softness was strategy. Softness was survival. It wasn't the blade that saved us from extinction. It was the boot, the blanket, the bag of dried berries hidden beneath a child's sleeping mat. In a world built on ice, it was the things that bent, not the ones that broke, that carried us forward. Their names were never carved into stone. They left behind no thrones, no empires, but they shaped the world just the same. The people you've never heard of, the quiet ones, the unseen ones, were the foundation. They held the line when no one else could. They taught without words. They fixed what others broke. They stitched warmth into furs, stored fire inside memory, passed knowledge through gesture, rhythm, silence. They were never called heroes, but they kept the children alive. They were never worshipped, but they made the shelters stand. They were never crowned, but they traded across continents, healed the sick, turned bone into tools and loss into story. And then they vanished. Not all at once, but slowly, swallowed by time, by dirt, by the forgetting nature of progress. But trace the roots of every invention, every needle, every fire pit, every seed planted with intent, and you'll find them. You'll find their hands, their patience, their vision that asked, not how to conquer this world, but how to live in it, together. Their greatness wasn't loud. It was steady. It wasn't in what they took, but in what they gave. And that, perhaps, is the truest kind of legacy. Not to be remembered by name, but to be felt in everything that endures. So the next time you light a fire, tell a story, or build something that lasts, remember, you're not just surviving. You're continuing something ancient, something quiet, something invisible, but never forgotten. We often forget them, the ones without names, the ones who built no temples, yet built the world. They were the ones who kept the fire alive when the wind howled through stone, who stitched torn cloaks instead of throwing them away, who taught children to touch the earth without hurting it. They weren't heroes in the history books, but they're the reason we lived long enough to write them. Every time you light a fire, tell a story, or raise a roof above someone you love, you are continuing something older than civilization itself: continuity, care, refusal to disappear. And if you believe those quiet things are worth remembering, subscribe to Prehistoric Shadows, because history isn't only written by kings and conquerors. Sometimes it's written by those who kept dinner warm, and their stories are only now being told.